I first saw Prabhupada in New Vrindavan in 1972. I had visited one temple, and I was married with a child at the time, and they didn't have really any facility for householders, and they suggested, well, we have a farm where a lot of our families go. And so this was 72, and actually that was Seattle, Washington. We were from Illinois. So we drove all the way back. We had gone from Illinois to Seattle. We drove all the way back to West Virginia, about over 2,000 miles. And we finally found the place, going through the winding hills of West Virginia. We came to the temple, and all these devotees were there. And we had no idea what was going on. And then people started saying, he's coming, he's coming. And we walked into the temple room, and it turned out that it was the day after Vyasa Puja in 1972. Srila Prabhupada had just installed Radha Vrindavan Chandra in the farm, and he was about to sit down and give an evening class, a Bhagavad-gita class. Well, first there was Artik, which was just incredible. So it was my wife, Mantarini, and I, and we saw Srila Prabhupada speak there in New Vrindavan with the devotees. And we didn't know a lot of philosophy then. We'd read Bhagavad-gita some, and Prabhupada's accent, of course, was heavy and hard for us to understand. So even though I didn't hear many of his words exactly, my wife and I at that moment were absolutely convinced this was our guru. This was our spiritual master. We had found him. And Prabhupada's whole presence and his demeanor was just amazing. You could practically, at least to us, when he would close his eyes, of course, when he spoke, and sometimes he would open his eyes wide and you could practically see light coming from his eyes. I mean, it was just such an amazing experience, just being in his presence. We were convinced. And anyway, we found out they were opening the temple in Chicago. Our home is Illinois, and so we drove back and joined the Chicago temple after that. One other very interesting incident there was we had our Bhaktivedanta Institute scholars come, and there was one night darshan where they were giving a presentation to Prabhupada, and I was fortunate enough to be able to be in that darshan. And they were presenting many of their preliminary ideas. Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj, then Brahmachari, was presenting some of the concepts that they were putting into their books, what would later become Life Comes from Life and their other writings. And it was almost like they wanted to give them first to Srila Prabhupada, kind of get his seal of approval, so then they would continue publishing their books. At one point, Swarup Damodar was talking about the difference between life and matter. So he gave a very obvious example. Things that are living, and he said, and things that are not living or dead, such as rocks or stones. Prabhupada stopped him, said, oh, stones can be alive? Well, everyone had to kind of stop and take that in. We hadn't heard anything like this before, and I could see that the scientists were busy trying to have to redo that part of the paper, the presentation, like, what does Prabhupada mean? And Prabhupada later went on to explain how all living entities go through the different stages of life, from birth, transformation, byproducts, dwindling, and death. And he said, so? He says, you see a mountain. It goes through all these processes, it grows, it stops, etc. And someone said, what about like a crystal? And Prabhupada said, yes, a crystal, you see it's growing. And he gave examples like this. There's still a little confusion about that, because someone said, well, when you see a rock, you pick up a rock, I mean, it doesn't seem to be alive. Prabhupada said, no, it's dead now. Oh, he said, just like you go in a forest. A tree is alive. It falls, it dies, and you see the log and it's decomposing. It was alive, now it's dead. In the same way, many of these stones or mountains or rocks were alive, and now they're not. So it actually made perfect sense, but it was very different from our conception. And so Prabhupada in this way was always giving us this very new and fresh information and knowledge. Srila Prabhupada always challenged us to do more, to get better results, to get greater results. One example of this was in Miami in 1974 when he came to visit. We had actually not been distributing books, but about a month or two before, I think, knowing Srila Prabhupada was coming, we ordered 10,000 Back to Godheads, and we were distributing Back to Godheads. So when Prabhupada came, one of the first questions he asked the temple president was, are you distributing my books? And he said proudly, yes, we are distributing 10,000 Back to Godheads this month. And Srila Prabhupada said, oh, no big books? So kind of took us all a little bit by surprise. So Srila Prabhupada was never satisfied with small results. He wanted to keep pushing us to do more. And that was one of the things that we see consistently throughout Srila Prabhupada. But he did it in such a way that was always encouraging to us. In Potomac, which was in 1976, when Prabhupada came, it was actually the centennial, and there's some other stories about that. But just to show his attention to detail, the first thing is Prabhupada came to his quarters, and we had just constructed a brand new bathroom, or remodeled the bathroom completely. Apparently, in his last stop, the toilet wasn't working. So he said, "Are you sure everything works?" And we said, "Absolutely, Prabhupada. It's a brand new bathroom." He says, we'll see. He was a little bit incredulous. So the first thing he did was ask for some chapati dough. He took the dough, rolled it in a ball, put it in the toilet, and flushed it to make sure it was working. And so he was satisfied. So what happened is about 2 days later, the shower, fortunately, I think he wasn't in it and there was no harm, but the whole glass shower door fell out and broke onto the ground. So Prabhupada's apprehension about our new bathroom was well-founded. We were walking outside near the temple, and there was our electric line came in from there was a large transformer that was up on the pole, and there was a little tiny red light about 60 feet up that was blinking. And Prabhupada looked up. We had never seen this. We never noticed it. Prabhupada said, "What is that red light?" I said, "We don't know." Prabhupada said, "You should find out." Well, we forgot all about that. Prabhupada was there. So many things were happening. Now, this was July, so Janmashtami was coming up soon. Janmashtami, this is after Prabhupada left. Janmashtami, we had a huge program where we were running extra lights everywhere. Really using a lot of electricity. What happened? That whole transformer blew up, and everything went dark. So again, Prabhupada somehow had some cognition that there was a problem there that completely escaped us. And these were the kind of things that we always found with Srila Prabhupada, that he seemed to have this kind of attention to detail, and not just details like that, but he was also very attentive to our management. There's, of course, many stories about Prabhupada, how he accounted for every penny and in his journals and his diaries. And so this was typical of Prabhupada. He was not unconcerned with the finances and with the business operations of his temples. When Srila Prabhupada came into the temple room in Potomac, and just to preface that, the temple president had spent a lot of money getting ready for Prabhupada. He had spent tens of thousands of dollars, which actually put us in debt, for it took us months to pay it off. I mean, it was for Srila Prabhupada. He was well intended, but perhaps not really quite the way to manage. And Srila Prabhupada sort of exposed that. When Srila Prabhupada sat down as Vyasa-san, he looked up, and we had just put in these beautiful chandeliers in the Potomac temple room. I think they're still there. And Prabhupada said to the temple president there on the Vyasa-san, he said, "How much did those chandeliers cost?" And the president said, $5,000, Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada said, he said, "Be very careful how you spend Krishna's money." So this was obviously an instruction for all of us to be very careful in spending money and doing things in a very planned and practical way. One of the amazing things about Srila Prabhupada was how he was always providing new insight, fresh information, new experiences for the devotees. We would encounter things we never had before and ideas that we hadn't previously thought through Srila Prabhupada. And he exhibits some of these in different ways. In Miami, he was giving classes under the banyan tree in Coconut Grove. This was 1974, Bhagavad-gita class at night. At one point, he was talking about devotees coming to Krishna consciousness. And of course, many of us thought we were somewhat philosophically inclined, and because we'd read the books and we were so intelligent, naturally we had become devotees. Prabhupada said, "Actually, all of you have come because of prasadam." Well, that was, everyone laughed and was very amused by that. And he turned to the temple president, who was a very intelligent, a very intelligent, cultured individual. And he said, "You too, you also because of prasadam." So that gave us actually a little humility as well as insight about the power of prasadam. Another thing that happened, I think during that same darshan, or that same class at night, he was taking questions. And a young man who had recently been coming to the temple, but was a little disturbed. We knew that he wasn't exactly all there, we could say, or had some emotional disturbance. He said to Srila Prabhupada in almost a challenging way, "Why do we have to follow the regular principles?" There was a hush in the crowd. We all wondered, how is Prabhupada going to answer this? Prabhupada sat back for a moment, and then he roared, "To keep you from going to hell." And it was so forceful that that young man, you could almost see him jump back 2 or 3 feet. It's almost like the force of that, was just incredible, and he was stunned. Now, of course, we all should take that to heart and realize, not just this young man, but because of all of our sinful activities in the past, Prabhupada had indeed saved us from going to hell. So again, very, very instructive stories that he would tell us and lessons that we would get. Going back to Potomac in 1976, one thing that was a very interesting incident there was when it was the 4th of July, and there was a huge fireworks celebration downtown on what they call the Mall in Washington, D.C. Prabhupada heard about this. He said, "Let's go." We were all very surprised but happy. We all go on a little trip with Srila Prabhupada. Of course, we were hardly thinking there was going to be about 500,000 to 1 million other people along with us. Anyway, Prabhupada got in a car, and there was a van, I think, full of brahmacharis, a big Sankirtan party, kirtan behind him, and then several of us in our cars were all behind, so we had this whole troop. And we headed down over the Washington Parkway that goes over, it's over the Potomac River. So along the way, it's like very high, and thousands of people were lined up along the parkway so that they could see the fireworks. And the traffic was fairly slow because very, very crowded, and we were headed to downtown DC. And so the Kirtan party had all their doors and windows open in the van, and they're going. And so many, many people were hearing the Kirtan, and a lot of the young people, most of them intoxicated at that point on a holiday weekend, a lot of them were chanting kind of along Hare Krishna, almost making fun of it, and like kind of jeering and chanting along with it. So we got down to the fireworks, finally. Prabhupada, I think, was sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and the fireworks were down at the other end of the mall there. Prabhupada said 1 or 2 go off. He said, "Okay, that's enough, let's go." He wasn't that impressed, So we all came back. Now later, Srila Prabhupada said, the best part of that was when the Kirtan party was going, and all those young people, you saw that they were chanting Hare Krishna. He said, even if they were chanting in jest or making fun, it does not matter. He said they were hearing and chanting the holy name, and their spiritual life has begun. So that was very, very instructive to understand the power of the holy name and taking kirtan to the street. One other example of just an interesting anecdote with Srila Prabhupada when he was in Potomac. We know that July was the founding of ISKCON and the incorporation of ISKCON, and in 1976 it was the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of ISKCON. So we baked a big cake and presented Srila Prabhupada as an anniversary cake. And so as part of that ceremony, the devotees handed him a knife. And he looked at it like bewildered. What am I supposed to do? Of course, in America, the custom is that the guest of honor cuts the first piece of a cake. Now, if you think about it from a Vaishnava or Vedic perspective, to ask your spiritual master to cut the cake and serve it to you as your disciple is completely wrong. And Prabhupada probably had no idea of this American custom. So somebody explained it to him how he should cut the first piece. And Prabhupada did not lecture us on how this was inappropriate. He smiled and he graciously accepted our cultural customs, cut the piece of cake, and then handed the knife off to another disciple to continue. So Prabhupada was always gracious and encouraging like that. Another way that Srila Prabhupada was very encouraging to his disciples was often the way that he would treat, I would say, everyday or the average disciples who weren't big leaders, and particularly the women and children. So discussing some anecdotes about that, in Potomac, one time, my wife had previously made ice cream for Srila Prabhupada, and he seemed to enjoy it. I went out and bought the ingredients, and so she made homemade ice cream. I brought it to him one evening, and the servants and everyone was there said, "Oh, he just had ice cream." That they shipped it in on dry ice from New Vrindavan, from the New Vrindavan cows. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to compete with this. There goes my ice cream offering. But Prabhupada heard there was ice cream, and he said, "What flavor?" And I said, "Mango." Prabhupada said, "Oh, bring it." We were intelligent enough to know that Prabhupada liked mango very much. So Prabhupada tasted the ice cream, and he said, "This is very good. This is the best." He said, "This is better than Bengali ice cream." I don't know what that means or what kind of ice cream they have in Bengal, but I took it as a compliment. And he said, "Bring it every night." And of course, that was an instruction I was very happy to carry out. Other examples of how he would encourage the devotees would be the way he would treat the women and children movement with such love and care. Sometimes we think of Srila Prabhupada, we see pictures with all the sannyasis, gathered around him. And of course, he did have to spend time with his leaders because he had to give them personal instruction. But Prabhupada would take time for all the devotees, whenever possible. When we were in Miami in 1974, all the devotees were out on Sankirtan, and Prabhupada was pretty much there alone, except for some of the women and children. So my wife came to Prabhupada's room, and she brought our daughter, who's in Gopinath, whose name was Anya then, and she had made a nice picture when she was in the Gurukul of Krishna. Now, it was a child's 5-year-old picture, nothing special, although she was a pretty good artist. It was a nice picture, but she's 5 years old. Somehow, and I want to say by the mercy of Shruti Kirti, who was always very kind to all of the devotees, he let her come in. And he said, "Oh, come on in. Prabhupada's not doing anything." Well, Prabhupada's always doing something, but what he meant was he's not within another meeting with somebody. And so she presented, Prabhupada said, "Who is this?" And my wife said that this is my daughter. And he said, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm her mother." My wife said, "Why didn't I even think to even give Prabhupada my name? I just said I'm her mother." So she gave the painting or the drawing to Srila Prabhupada. He looked at it very solemnly and said, "Very great art, very great art." Again, so you can imagine how encouraging that was. Also, I remember in San Francisco, I think it was 1974 when Prabhupada visited there in California. This is the famous Rath Yatra where Prabhupada got down and jumped, was chanting and dancing. That was really wonderful to see in person. We were there. But during one lecture at the temple, my wife was with our daughter, Lalita, and one of the other children started crying or making noise. So the sannyasi said, "All the women have to go out. You have to leave the temple." My wife is, of course, devastated. Here I can't even hear my spiritual master give class. I'm here for Prabhupada to see Prabhupada. So they had to go back in her room and couldn't even hear the class. But at the end of class, as often they did, they brought Srila Prabhupada cookies to give out. And so he called for the children. The doors opened. He asked for all the women and children to come in. The sannyasis had to part. All the kids came up and Prabhupada gave them cookies. My daughter Lalita Saki now, was about 1.5 years old. And so she had a little trouble reaching the cookies. So Prabhupada very carefully put it in her hand so that she could have that cookie. And of course, and this was so pleasing to the mothers and to the children because they saw here was a moment when they and their children got some special attention from Srila Prabhupada. Again, Prabhupada's great kindness. There was one very special experience with Lalita. Going back to Miami again, when she was about 2 years old, they were taking a tour of the property. And again, most of the men were out on Sankirtan, so a lot of the women left and a few of the temple leaders. And my wife was pushing Lalita in her stroller. Now, Lalita had always seen pictures of Prabhupada, but here, somehow she put it together in her little mind that this was really Prabhupada, this was not the picture, so she kept saying during the whole time, pointing, saying, "Prabhupada, Prabhupada," just amazed it really is Prabhupada. I've always heard these pictures, everyone says this is Prabhupada, now he's really here. And so at the end of the tour, Prabhupada's walking up the steps of the porch to where he's staying. He turns around and says, "Who was that baby calling my name?" And so my wife thought, this is the opportunity, we can't miss this. So she holds my daughter up, straight out, and Lalita holds out her arms towards Prabhupada, and Prabhupada and her looked at her for a long, long time. It's like their eyes were locked. And my wife reports that Lalita was like practically shivering, and having almost like ecstatic symptoms, looking at Prabhupada. And Prabhupada just folded his hand and said, "Thank you very much." So we don't know what this means, but we know that somehow, first of all, these children are very special. in the relationships, probably with Srila Prabhupada, but also just showing the kindness of Prabhupada, how he would always take just that moment to give every devotee something a little bit extra.
Je anilo premadana karuna prachu